going to try and read as politely as possible. Misha is the Director of Research at CTTC in Barcelona. He's a distinguished lecturer of IEEE ComSoc and a senior member of the IEEE. And he's the Editor-in-Chief of ETT, and he'll probably tell you what that is if you don't know. He's a tech company investor and entrepreneur, and he's co-founder and former CTO and now board member of World Sensing, the machine-to-machine company selling into smart cities, construction, and the oil gas market verticals. In the past, he's been affiliated with France Telecom in research development, and he's in the past been a lecturer at King's College in London. And he originally earned his PhD in telecommunications from King's College in London. So, here to talk about silicon pollution and depollution.
I guess you can turn it as you want, but in the end, when it is about urban environments, cities, etc., you know, you have three elements. You have what everybody thinks about. You have the infrastructure. You also have, you have people. We talked very little about this, but we do have people. And we have a biosphere. So we have animals, we have parks, we have trees. And it turns out that each of them, you know, has a kind of an individual component. It's about us humans as an individual. It's about the bird. It's about the bridge, the building. But also all together, they form a crowd and an ensemble, okay, which changes the whole picture. So you and you and you and you make a classroom and a classroom, you know, makes a university with an environment makes a city. So you put them all together, and we have two elements here, which is the individual element and the crowd element, really. Now, a million years ago, something like this, we had maybe just one of these. We had just maybe the ecosystem, the biosphere, actually, which is animals, people, whatever, you know, in very early stages, was just one of them. Now, as time passed on, from 1 million to 100,000, 10,000, etc., you know, a second of these ecosystem carved out, which is as humans at the end of the day. So now we have back then 2 of them. As of today, we have 3. So in the city, if you look around, we have people, we have infrastructures, we have a biosphere, and they're all competing. Okay, so whenever we build a bridge, or whenever we build a building, or whenever we build a road, we cut out some space from parks. We cut out some space actually for a large amount of people having a good time, etc. So you understand, we're all fighting and you know, trying to come to terms. And it seems like we should find a balance here. Okay, a balance between these 3 ecosystems. You know, the infrastructure people and the biosphere. Now, as it turns out, and as we discussed yesterday, as long as people are in the equation, balance really sucks, okay? Really sucks. We have not come out of the cave because we were in balance. We have not invented the light bulb because we're in balance. We did not land on the moon because we're in balance. Humans trying to move, to create, to unbalance, in fact, to destroy. So any philosopher in the past centuries who spent more than a day thinking about this came to this very same conclusion. Okay, you have maybe Goethe was the best one who brought it to the point, who in Faust says, you know, if you want to create, you need to destroy. Now that's a very different concept to balance. Okay? Now, people who only see balance as a solution, they end up writing novels like Orwell, or maybe in more modern times, I'm not sure you know, I wrote a book, Delirium, proposing to re-engineer people. The only way out, striking a good, you know, good kind of ecosystem is to re-engineer people, modified brain, whatever. Now we don't want to do that, and maybe one of the reasons, you know, we haven't come to a good solution is because we're always trying to look for this balance. We're always trying to look for this yin yang, whatever you call it. I don't think it's the right solution. Okay, so let's not call it balance. Let's call it, I don't know how to call it. I'll leave it to you. You know, call it whatever, an urban gravitational force which holds things together. Call it, you know, an urban purpose. Call it an urban religion, whatever you want to call it, you know, something. Loads of elements to that, and I think that should be the focus of future designs over the next decades to make things work eventually. There may be 2 or 3 elements which I would like to talk about, and one element is the technology side, and another element is the human side. So we've talked very little about the human part. Yesterday, a lot of people complained about it, so I thought, I'd just chip this in and go through some points today. On the technology side, so we had a great discussion like an hour earlier, and a lot of stuff has been said about IoT. Yesterday, we talked a lot about the technology. So I will not talk about the potential of instrumentation. I will not talk about the return on investment models. We will talk about all that. I want to talk about one thing which I realized by actually running my own company. So I also have a company where we actually deploy things. So we're not a PowerPoint company, we're not consulting. We're actually going in the field, getting our hands dirty, deploying sensors. So what happened is we won a very big smart city tender. And the technology arrived in our offices. And when I entered this office, I was just really shocked, because I saw piles and piles and piles of batteries. You don't have an idea how much we pollute until you actually have to deploy things. Some people in this room may have experimented from an academic point of view, rolled out 10 sensors, maybe 20, maybe 50. We're rolling out thousands. And the moment you get in, the technology, the silicon, the electronics, the boards, the batteries, you understand the impact and harm you actually do to the environment at the simple cost of becoming more intelligent. Okay? So, and the similarity which I saw was actually, we have gone through this exercise before. We had, maybe 100 years ago, started building roads, buildings, using concrete, cement, etc. There's a lot of silicon in there as well. We have been siliconifying the environment, 50 years, 100 years ago as well, with the ultimate aim to make our life more convenient. So we can drive the car, we have a roof on our head, etc. And as of today, what we try to do is we try to get a lot of this silicon out again. So we're building parks again. We are creating green space because we understand that this siliconization of 50 years, 100 years ago was maybe not a good idea. But what we do on the other hand as well right now is we're siliconifying it again with batteries, sensors, etc., etc. Just again to facilitate a better living. I'm trying to make things smart, get more data, allow me to know where I park my car, which road I should be using because there's a traffic jam, etc., etc. So the big question I leave to the audience, I don't want to answer that question. My big question I leave to the audience is, can we learn something from the urban planning exercise of the last 50 years when it was all about building bridges, roads, buildings, and apply that to the IoT space, where we again roll out a lot of stuff to do something very, very similar, even though the technology is completely different. Okay? So back then, a whole era of architects emerged. So I'm sure that in 50 years' time we'll have an whole area of IoT architects doing maybe exactly what these architects do today. So I'll leave that with you. The only thing I would like for the more techie geeks in this room to outline some directions which you could go down to really do something about it. First thing is, I think we need to know much more about energy scavenging, use much more this type of technology. There's a lot of stuff being done. We are involved at CTTC, we're involved in a lot of energy scavenging projects. So the idea is to not use batteries altogether. So you're just using solar energy, there's a lot of stuff out there, wind energy, vibration energy, and try to store it in a supercapacitance and hope that your sensors is actually able to survive or do measure and instrument and communicate what it needs to do. So that's an area which I think will really take off very soon, and there's a lot of industry currently beefing up in this direction. So the energy scavenging part is very interesting. Another one which we talked about a little bit is the idea of virtualization. So virtualization always means you're decoupling things, okay? And what we decouple here is, and that's the concept I've been driving for the last 3-4 years, and we have a very interesting project on this as well. The idea is to make sure that if we roll out infrastructure, sensors and all that, okay, that we don't need to duplicate and triplicate this type of technology. An example is if the town hall wants to know the state of the pollution in the town, and a private contractor, might be Siemens or whatever, an ABB or whoever wants to know the state of the pollution, that they do not triplicate the sensors and the batteries and everything which is involved with that. It's not worth it. Let's just roll it out once and have mechanisms in place which allow the people who actually put value on this reuse that. So you call that virtualization, you're decoupling. You're decoupling the hardware infrastructure from the software infrastructure from the service providers. We've done this before in the computing industry, it worked so well. Okay? So the Dells and Intels have developed independently, the Microsofts have been involved independently, and the Facebooks have evolved independently. So we have to do the very same exercise in the IoT world. So the world, I think the word of virtualization will come more and more out there as the amount of infrastructure actually increases. Okay, that's one, and the third one I don't remember. Yeah, maybe the third one, an interesting thing to look at is biodegradable electronics. That's something, it's not my field at all, but I could imagine that it really has some value. I know, my company has at some point looked into providing fire alarm sensors to forests like Russia. They have a big problem there. Just out of Moscow, there's a lot of dry wood. When you monitor that, you essentially get to know when the fire is breaking out, etc. In the end, we decided the return on investment model was very risky, very good, but very risky, so we didn't go down there. But when I did my research on that, I came across electronics, which apparently, if you burn it over time, it actually degrades into something, which can just live in the forest, which is very good. I think that's the type of direction we should go. Okay, put some memory maybe in the whole list. Okay, so my computer lives forever, but maybe my IoT network should have a lifetime of what, 5 years, 10 years? Which solves also all the data problem, or the data storage problem. The Facebook problem, like if you post something really naughty at the age of 15, at the age of 30, it just has degraded, okay? So these type of elements, putting a little bit of memory in there, I think that's the type of direction which is worth pursuing. Okay, now apart from the technology, I promised you to talk a little bit more about the human side. And it's a component, I think, which is very important. I'm a very technology guy, and I have not understood the importance of humans in the whole game until very recently. Okay, so the idea is really to actually, get us out of our kind of narcissistic iSphere. Okay, get us away from the iPhone and iCloud to a WeCloud. Okay, to something where we engage. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but it seems like a very interesting way to go down this road is empathy. So we have a specialist, at least one specialist in the room here. And I've come across the notion of all that via two works, actually, quite independently. So one is via Natalie Jeremienko. She's a pioneer, actually, in urban design. She worked with Mark Weiser, and she's done some really incredible things in New York and worldwide. And you're very lucky to have her here tomorrow. So if you have a chance, just come and listen to her stuff. So I don't want to steal her show. It's just unbelievable what she's doing. But she's, say it again?
Sorry, 6 o'clock for
6 o'clock, yes. But what she's doing, she's bridging exactly these bridges. So between infrastructure and humans, humans and animals and infrastructure. So she has done things where you really say, yeah, this is amazing. So she puts everybody at kind of the same level. You would never look at a small bug. She's designed methods of making you see the invisible. Okay, it's really pioneering work. And by doing this, clearly she creates some relationships. So the moment you start seeing small bugs, the moment you start seeing butterflies at your scale, the moment you start to see fishes or notice they're there, you can engage and you create a sense of empathy for that. Okay? So she's never used the word empathy. I've never heard her using this word, actually, so I'm not sure she's aware of that. Now, the one I really heard using this word is Mara Balestrini. She used to work in the town hall in Barcelona on smart city projects. And a lot of technology, so she's also a little bit of a technology girl, so she's also a psychologist. She probably realized down the road the real core of the problem of people, so now she's at UCL in London, working precisely on the problem of empathy. So empathy empathy seems to be the way, and we have one person down here who also has been making a strong case yesterday on that. So it seems to be something which is slowly taken off because it comes to the very same problem of engaging people with whatever is around, you know, technology, etc. Now, if you look at how empathy comes along, as you become empathetic if you know, through love, through anger, through shock, through whatever is out there, some very strong emotions essentially. Okay, so a good love example is when people start engaging as a simple experiment. If you ask some people to start painting, let's say the University Imperial College, okay, so the rector, the principal fires out an email saying, hey guys, we've run out of money, and there's some pots of paint out there. We can't pay the painters, but could you paint that? I think very few people would do that. On the other hand, if the dean of a school fires out an email telling to the parents, guys, look, our school doesn't have enough money to pay a painter. Could you please come and actually paint the walls and help us to restructure the school? I'm sure that will happen because you actually have a very strong connection to the school through the kids you love. Okay? Another example I've been reading up recently actually comes more through anger. So I think it's a Canadian group, if I'm not wrong. They actually, what they did is they created a kind of association in a neighborhood, and they started painting a bicycle lane on the road simply because a bicyclist had been killed. Okay, so they became angry about it because the car space was too big. There's no space for bicycles. So they said, well, we take the fate in our own hand. We start painting the bicycle lane. Okay, so the town hall agreed on some parts, and some parts they did not agree. So the message is, they engaged here, they engaged really through anger. And the problem of whether it's love or anger, it's twofold. The first thing is we cannot really wait until a bicyclist dies, until you fall in love. We also have to be very careful because everything human actually, fades out over time. It's transitional. So if we want to work really on this very core problem of engaging people with technology to make the urban space more living, more intelligent, more smart, you need to make sure that this empathy essentially could maybe be even engineered. This is up to the people who work on that, and that you have mechanisms in place which renew this empathy all the time. So don't rely on empathy kind of you have come up with a good mechanism. Then this will last forever. It will last for 2 months, 3 months. See, I lived in London a few years ago. Back then, the whole thing with big issue just started. People selling the big issue in the streets. People had a lot of kind of empathetic relationship buying and a lot of this. It has disappeared now. I don't see it so much anymore as it has been actually 10 years ago. So things fade out as everything which is human. So make sure you actually make this a transit. Okay. So on the engineering side, what could be interesting maybe to make an experiment is to actually, have a town hall say that, artificially engineer some news and just facilitate, painting to be around. As an example, they just say, okay, there was a bicyclist which has been hurt, which is not true. It's a lie, okay? But it will actually gather people to do, things which otherwise they wouldn't have done. So I'm not a specialist in this, but I could imagine that if you start channeling, some of the energy we have towards building up this empathetic relationship, this could really help for people taking up the technology and actually, facilitate the offtake of the IoT. And the problem, I've worked on IoT for the past 10 years, and from Silicon it has not happened because we have not built this bridge between the human and the actual technology. Even though the return of investment sheets were clear, even though the use cases were clear, even though it was very useful, but it's not enough. It's really not enough. There seems to be another component which you need to bring in to make this happen. Okay? So to summarize, I think IoT is really, a facilitator, and I think empathy, to be seen, is a vehicle to make sure that all these urban developments, come from what we talked about yesterday, from this being perceived as a luxury to come into a phase where it is perceived as a commodity, and at some point maybe even as a necessity. That would be ideal. And one of the biggest problems you have is, of course, to engage people, to draw a very fair picture of society you engage. So we talked about yesterday, crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing sounds great, but there's a problem here. Because those you engage with crowdsourcing to, figure out whether they can use the technology, etc., is a very specific layer. This is you. You're not people who work in the construction site. You're not people who are actually out there selling in the supermarket. There's a completely, different society out there. There's so many different layers out there. And I notice it because what I do very often in Barcelona is I invite some of my Twitter followers for breakfast, just to meet people, completely random. And I understand that really this society is composed of so different views than whatever we bring together. This is a very harmonic view, even though we disagree on a lot of things. But if you look beyond these boundaries, you realize, the world is so much bigger. So I think we need to make sure for this to happen. Okay, I'll leave it almost with this. I just want to tell you that I think, the whole urban development is not important. I think there's something actually which is much more important, which needs to be done. And the reason is as follows. I think cities, we agree on all that cities, it's difficult to live here with all its, cities with all its advantages, disadvantages. But in the end, I think the density of cities has reached kind of a peak, so we can't bring in many more people anymore. For the city to grow, they can only happen two things. Either it grows in size, okay, so density is very difficult, or you start creating cities just beside, like they did in China and they grew there, etc. But what really causes the urban headache, I think, is density. Okay, what really is a big problem is density now. So we can use a lot of urban design, a lot of urban technology, IoT, etc., to help essentially alleviating some of the problems which result from the density problem. Maybe you can improve urban living by 10%, maybe you can improve urban living by 20%, I don't know. It's just a certain fraction, you cannot do more. So I think we're creating much more bubble here actually on that. So I don't think it's so problematic. It's a hype word, we all agree on that, okay? We'll love that, smart city, sustainable city, etc. I think the problem will be somewhere else. I think the problem will very soon come actually from the rural area. And there was a chap yesterday who talked about a very interesting project they did in Egypt, where they tried to look about this relationship between urban environment and rural environment, because it's a rural area which in the end has to support, the food chain, the oxygen chain, etc. of the city. So I think there's a lot of things still to be said about this symbiosis between rural environment and urban environment, maybe moving from the smart city to a smart field. We'll see about this. Okay, so I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions if you want to stay up the front. Yes. Let's start from left to right.
I think one of the reasons why this is not occurring is because we have a lot of institutionalized structures that don't want to change, and that we have a legal system which means that the risk assessment of doing anything. So, we live in a litigation society. So how do we overcome that?
We overcome that with smart procurement. Yesterday there was a Duncan here who talked about this, and I think that's a very, very big problem, really, or a solution. So, you're right. So the urban game currently is dictated by a big place. Okay, like Telven, Avertis, you've never heard of them. Okay, they're the one who own the space. They're the one who draw the parking machines, etc., etc. Apart from you heard of IBMs and Cisco's, but the other players out there. They're very reluctant of leaving space for innovation, etc., etc. So when it comes to procurements, they will go for the cheapest solution. Okay, the minimum which you can do, and then the price dictates. What we need is, what was done and was actually advocating yesterday, is to have smart procurement. So not necessarily the minimum and the cheapest, but maybe which gives some intelligence on top on the long term. So a solution which really brings in something new. And I think that's the only way of doing it. So if you want to accelerate innovation in this space, you need to at least from this point of view, govern that from the top.
In the built environment and through construction processes, we can make things rather transparent quite easily, because architects and urban planners are required to produce life cycle assessments for their projects. Often enough, if that information is to be made public, then you can possibly encourage large companies to become much more responsible, and it is quite easy to try and achieve that. Then it could even encourage eco-industrial design in the long run and have repercussions on the manufacturing industry and bringing things local.
Somebody, I just want to chip in on that. So, you know, I'm advising Richard Brunson's Carbon War Room. It's an initiative which is a machine-to-machine initiative where he had the ideas, look, let's look at technologies which can really bring, you know, the carbon emission down to zero, but let's look at technologies which really give you revenues. So not the one which only give benefit, but the one which actually, you know, have some revenue behind it. They did the exercise with the guys in New York, Matt, etc. And they came up with a list of items which really could have an enormous impact, but also scale economically. In the end, you know, we live in a capitalistic environment, so we have to take, you know, the rules of the game into account. And I think that's the right way to go if you want to make it happen.
I'm really interested in kind of your France-Telecom example that you talked about where you had very high return on investment and why that wasn't chosen to go ahead. Can you give us a little bit of a
So, you know, when we talk about return on investment, now I'm not an economist, but I've run my own company, so I understand a little bit the game. I think you have to differentiate between, you know, B2C, business to customer kind of, and B2B, okay? So the B2C is, I think it's a very subtle market. I'm not very familiar with that, but in France Telecom, we targeted that market. We just thought, you know, if people would buy an extra dongle for 20 euros and some sensors for maybe another 15 euros, they could have an intelligent lamp and temperature, and that would be, even though it's useful, you know, but people didn't do it, okay? The B2B market is much more, you know, first order kind of return of investment derivative. So they have to understand how much money can I make and what time, when does the technology pay back, etc. So I think, you know, that the mistake we did in France Telecom back then is we presumed that just having your sensor network doing something useful would make it people buy it, which it didn't. Okay, so I haven't done any market study here, but this was the situation, so we discontinued that.
We've got time for one last question.
How do you feel on 3D printing potentially revolutionising the actual supply chain?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So I think 3D printing, no, I haven't spent any much time on that, but I think, you know, it will clearly localize a lot of things, I believe. Okay, so because suddenly you can actually manufacture things like locally, and I think that will create maybe a stronger sense of community. I think it may things actually make more expensive because you will end up probably with things which are very cheap to manufacture, but very original in the actual embodiment, like a Picasso. The cost of a Picasso material is like, what, 10 cents, okay? But how you do that, you know, the whole thing, how you drew a line, etc., makes it very expensive. So I think that the very same may happen actually with local manufacturing. I don't know. And there might be a copyright issue, which I think is interesting to look at. You know, how do you put copyrights onto, how do you put watermarking on all that? So I don't know. So we'll see how this plays out in the urban environment. I really don't know.
Take one follow-up because it's on the same
Just
topic.
a small comment. I think that is quite easily linked to recycling and the encouragement of recycling processes, which is still part of the life cycle assessment that urban environment designers are currently obsessed with.
I'm afraid, though, that, you know, doing things locally is always more expensive than globally. It's a fact. The same with energy. Okay, people talk about renewable, but if you look at the joule per euro per joule, renewable is much more expensive than actually the nuclear power station or whatever. It's a fact. Now, of course, you have it for free, the local energy. So that's why it works kind of almost out, not really. So when you start manufacturing locally, you will pollute locally a lot. Who certifies that? Who looks at that, etc. Big manufacturing site, they are typically, you know, kind of controlled. So I think doing things distributed is always a good idea, but you need a sense of accountability. It's everywhere.
Actually reduce the level of pollution. Because if you are to source materials from long distances, the transportation of the material is more polluting than the manufacturing of the material plus the transportation. Therefore, I think, for instance, using steel against concrete is a big issue. Concrete lasts much longer, but steel is recyclable. So which one do you prefer? We can easily calculate such things and make better informed decisions in the long term.
Okay. Would you like to join me in saying thanks to Misha? Appreciate that. Duncan. Yeah. Sorry, surprise. Did you have a presentation? Or did you?
I think it's